Malik Carter sat on a hard bench in a dimly lit Atlanta precinct holding cell, the concrete walls smeared with jagged graffiti, spelling out names and curses in faded ink. The air choked him with the stench of stale urine, a sour tang that clung to the back of his throat like a bad memory. His wrist still stung from the handcuffs, the metal having bitten into his skin when the cops dragged him in. Now free of the restraints, he rubbed the red marks absent-mindedly, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. He was just a kid, 17 years old, an honor student who spent his evenings arguing mock trials at debate club, not robbing liquor stores. Yet here he was, labeled a criminal before he could even speak. The precinct buzzed with low voices and the occasional clatter of metal doors slamming shut, each sound making Malik flinch. 2 cops stood outside the cell, their laughter cutting through the haze of his thoughts. One, a stocky man with a buzz cut and a sunburned neck, leaned against the bars, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. He pointed at Malik with a meaty finger, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look at this future felon," he sneered. "Bet he's already planning his next hit." The other cop, taller with a patchy beard, chuckled and spat on the floor near Malik's feet. "Probably got a whole gang waiting for him," he added, scratching his chin like he'd just solved a puzzle. Malik's stomach churned, but he bit his tongue, knowing better than to talk back. He'd seen enough videos online, heard enough stories from his cousins about how speaking up could turn a bad situation deadly. Instead, he repeated the same plea he'd been muttering since they shoved him into the cruiser. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice low but steady. "I just want a phone call, please." The buzz-cut cop snorted, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You'll get your call when we say so, boy," he barked, turning away as if Malik were a speck of dirt on his boot. The dismissal stung worse than the words, a reminder of how invisible he was in their eyes, not a person, but a statistic they'd already written off. Malik's backpack, the one he'd slung over his shoulder while walking, home sat on a table across the room, its contents spilled out like a crime scene. Debate notes, a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a half-eaten granola bar, all scattered under the harsh lights. He watched, helpless, as the taller cop rummaged through it, tossing aside his carefully highlighted pages with a smirk. Then, with a deliberate slowness that made Malik's heart sink, the cop pulled something from his own pocket, a shiny silver watch with a cracked face, and slipped it into the pile. "Look what we got here," he called out, holding the watch up for his partner to see. "Matches the description of the stolen goods from the liquor store." Malik shot to his feet, his pulse hammering in his ears. "That's not mine," he shouted. "You can't just put that there. I saw you." The buzz-cut cop spun around, his face darkening like a storm cloud rolling in. He stalked over to the cell, slamming his fist against the bars with a clang that echoed through the room. "You calling me a liar?" he growled, his breath hot with the smell of stale coffee. Malik shrank back, the metal bench cold against his thighs, but he didn't break eye contact. "I'm telling the truth," he said. "Quieter now." "You know I am." The cop's lips curled into a sneer, but he didn't respond, just turned back to his partner with a nod. They both laughed again, a sound that scraped against Malik's nerves like sandpaper. The planted evidence sat there, gleaming under the lights, a silent promise of the hell waiting for him. Malik's mind raced, trying to piece together how this could happen, how a night as ordinary as any other could spiral into this. He thought of his mother, Shonda Carter, a nurse who worked double shifts at Grady Memorial to keep their small apartment afloat. She'd be home by now, probably pacing the kitchen, wondering why he wasn't back from debate club. The thought of her worrying made his chest tighten, a sharp ache that rivaled the sting in his wrists. He needed to get to her, to let her know he was okay or at least alive. But the cops weren't done with their game. Hours ticked by, the precinct clock's hands crawling past midnight, then 1 in the morning. Malik's legs cramped from sitting on the unyielding bench, but he didn't dare lie down, not with the way the cops kept glancing at him, their eyes glinting with something predatory. Finally, just as he thought he might scream from the tension, the precinct doors burst open and Shonda's voice cut through the stale air like a lifeline. "Where's my son?" she demanded, her tone fierce despite the tremor Malik knew meant she was terrified. He stood, pressing himself against the bars, catching a glimpse of her in her faded scrubs, her braids pulled back tight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Shonda," he called, his voice cracking with relief. "I'm here, I'm okay." But the buzz-cut cop stepped into her path, blocking her view with his bulk. "You need to calm down, Mom," he said, his voice thick with false patience. "Your boy's in a heap of trouble. Armed robbery, stolen goods, the works." Shonda pushed forward, undeterred, her eyes locking onto Malik's for a fleeting second before the cop grabbed her arm. "I raised him right," she snapped, yanking free. "He's no thief, you got the wrong kid." The taller cop snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "That's what they all say," he muttered. "Why don't you go home? Let us handle this." Malik saw the hurt flash across Shonda's face, the way her shoulders slumped for a moment before she straightened again, her jaw set. "I'm not leaving without seeing him," she said, her voice rising. "I know my rights." But the buzz-cut cop just smirked, gesturing to another officer to escort her out. "We'll call you when we're ready," he said. "Now get out before I charge you with obstruction." Malik watched, helpless, as Shonda was pushed toward the doors, her protests fading into the night. The precinct fell silent again, the weight of her absence heavier than the concrete around him. He sank back onto the bench, his mind spinning with what he'd just seen. The cop's disdain, the planted watch, the refusal to let him speak to his mother. It wasn't just a mistake, not anymore. This was something darker, something deliberate. As the hours dragged on, Malik overheard the buzz-cut cop on the phone, his voice low but clear enough to catch the name Judge Evelyn Hargrove. "She's expecting." "This one," the cop said, "wants it wrapped up quick." Malik's blood ran cold, the name unfamiliar but the intent unmistakable. Whoever this judge was, she was part of this, part of the machine grinding him down before he even had a chance to fight. The precinct lights flickered, casting long shadows across the cell, and Malik clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. He didn't know how deep this went, didn't know who was pulling the strings, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to let him walk away easy. The planted watch sat on the table, its cracked face catching the light like a taunt, sealing his fate for an arraignment he wasn't sure he'd survive. Malik closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, to think of Shonda's fierce determination, of the way she'd fought for him even when they pushed her out. He'd hold on to that, he decided, hold on to her until he could figure out what came. Next, because whatever it wasn't going to be fair, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be easy. Malik Carter stood in a packed Atlanta courtroom, sweat soaking through the borrowed suit his mother had brought him, the fabric scratching against his skin like sandpaper. The air was thick with the murmur of onlookers, their whispers buzzing, like flies around a carcass, and the faint scent of polished wood mingled with the nervous sweat of those waiting for their turn at justice. Malik's wrists burned from cuffs tightened too hard, the metal biting into the same red marks left from his arrest 2 nights ago. He shifted his weight, trying to steady his trembling legs, but the weight of the room pressed down on him, a suffocating reminder of how small he was in this place, how powerless. At the front of the courtroom, behind a towering bench, sat Judge Evelyn Hargrove, a gaunt woman with icy blue eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. Her grey hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not a strand out of place, and her thin lips were set in a line that promised no mercy. Malik had heard of her before, whispered rumors in his neighborhood about her reputation for locking up black teens without a second thought, her sentences heavy enough to crush entire futures. Now, seeing her in person, he felt those rumors solidify into a cold, hard truth. She didn't even look at him as she shuffled papers on her desk, her movements deliberate, almost bored, like she'd already decided his fate before he opened his mouth. To Malik's left stood his public defender, a woman named Ms. Ellis, her hands trembling as she flipped through a thin file that looked pitifully inadequate against the stack of documents on the prosecutor's table. Ms. Ellis was overworked, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her cheap blouse wrinkled from too many late nights. She'd barely spoken to Malik before they were ushered into the courtroom, muttering something about doing her best, but not promising much. It wasn't her fault, not really, but Malik couldn't help the sinking feeling that her best wouldn't be enough. Not here, not against this. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, Nathan Wells, adjusted his tie with a predator's grin, his wiry frame coiled with confidence. His pale skin gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his slicked back hair gave him the look of a man who knew he held all the cards. He glanced at Malik for a moment, his eyes glinting with something cruel, before turning to the judge with a nod, as if they shared a secret Malik wasn't privy to. The bailiff called the court to order, and a hush fell over the room, broken only by the faint creak of the gallery benches as people shifted to get a better view. Malik's eyes darted to the front row, where his mother, Shonda Carter, sat with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were pale against her dark skin. Her face was a mask of barely contained anguish, her eyes red from crying, her lips pressed together to keep from breaking down. Seeing her there, fighting for him even in her silence, made Malik's throat tighten, but he forced himself to look away, afraid he'd lose what little composure he had left. Judge Hargrove finally spoke, her voice sharp enough to slice through the tension. "State your name for the record," she said, still not looking up from the file in front of her, her tone as cold as the marble floor beneath Malik's feet. Malik cleared his throat, his mouth dry as sand. "Malik Carter, ma'am," he said, then caught Miss Ellis's quick nudge. "Your Honor," he corrected, his voice unsteady, barely above a whisper. Hargrove's eyes flicked up at that, pinning him with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. She held his stare for a moment, her expression unreadable, before returning to her papers with a faint sneer, as if he wasn't worth the effort of further scrutiny. Nathan Wells stood then, smoothing his jacket with a flourish, before addressing the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "the defendant has been positively identified as the perpetrator of an armed robbery that occurred at approximately 8:30 in the evening on July 12th at a liquor store on Peachtree Road. We have an eyewitness placing him at the scene, and I request that he be held without bail due to the severity of the charges." Malik's stomach dropped, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. An eyewitness? He hadn't been anywhere near Peachtree Road that night. He'd been at the library across town, poring over debate notes until it closed at 9. He turned to Miss Ellis, his eyes wide with panic, but she was already scrambling to her feet, clutching her file like a shield. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "my client insists he was at the library at the time of the alleged crime. We request time to obtain security footage that can prove his alibi." Malik nodded, clinging to her words like a lifeline, but Hargrove didn't even glance at Miss Ellis. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her icy gaze settling on Malik again, this time with a faint smirk that sent a shiver down his spine. "The evidence against him is strong," she said, her tone flat, almost rehearsed. "The court will set a hearing for 1 week from today." Malik's heart sank further. 1 week? That was an eternity, trapped in a system that seemed to have already convicted him. He opened his mouth to protest, to shout that they had the wrong person, that he was innocent, but Miss Ellis grabbed his arm, her grip tight with warning. Before he could speak, Hargrove continued, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Until then, the defendant will be remanded into custody." The gavel slammed down with a crack that echoed in Malik's ears, each bang a nail in the coffin of his hope. A murmur ran through the courtroom, a mix of gasps and whispers, and Malik heard his mother's choked sob from the gallery, a sound that tore at his chest like claws. He turned to see her standing, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she shook her head in disbelief. "Wait, no," she cried, her voice breaking. "This is a mistake. My son is innocent." The bailiff moved toward her, his broad shoulders blocking her path, but Shonda didn't back down. Her eyes locked on Malik's, as if she could will him free with her gaze alone. Malik's throat burned with unshed tears, his hands trembling. In the cuffs as he mouthed "I'm sorry" to her, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. Miss Ellis leaned in close, her voice a hurried whisper. "I'll do my best," she said, but her eyes were already clouded with defeat, and Malik knew what that meant. She didn't believe they could win, not against Hargrove, not against Wells, not against a system that seemed rigged from the start. Before Malik could respond, 2 officers grabbed him by the arms, their grips bruising as they pulled him away. From the stand. Shonda's voice followed him, desperate and fading, as the courtroom doors loomed closer. "Malik, baby, I'm going to fix this, I promise," she called, her words breaking on a sob. The last thing he saw before the doors slammed shut was her face, etched with desperation and fear, a mirror of the terror clawing at his own heart. The officers dragged him down a narrow hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects, their harsh glow casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Malik's legs felt like lead, each step a struggle as the reality of Hargrove's ruling sank in. No bail, no chance to go home, just a week of waiting in a cell while the world outside moved on without him. He thought of the library footage Ms. Ellis mentioned, the one piece of evidence that could prove he wasn't lying. But Hargrove hadn't even blinked at the request, hadn't cared enough to give him a fair shot. What kind of judge didn't care about the truth? What kind of system lets someone like Wells twist lies into facts with a smile? And what chance did a kid like him have against a courtroom where the deck was stacked before he even walked in? As the officers shoved him into a holding area to await transport to county jail, Malik's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Hargrove's smirk, Wells' confidence, the way they'd dismissed his alibi without a second thought, it all pointed to something bigger, something uglier than a simple mistake. He didn't know how he'd survive a week behind bars, didn't know if his mother could hold it together while he was gone. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a fight he hadn't asked for, but one he'd have to face whether he was ready or not. So what do you think about Judge Hargrove's cold dismissal of Malik's alibi? Drop a comment with the number 1 if you think this courtroom was rigged from the start. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe to see how Malik fights back against this injustice. Was Hargrove really just doing her job? Or is there something darker at play here? Stick around to find out what horrors await him in county jail, because the next twist might just break him. Malik Carter arrived at Fulton County Jail under a sky-bruised purple by dusk, the hulking fortress of despair looming ahead, like a predator waiting to swallow him whole. The transport van's engine sputtered to a stop, and the back doors creaked, open, revealing a barbed wire fence that glinted faintly in the dying light. Malik's wrists ached from the cuffs, his borrowed suit now rumpled and stained with sweat, a far cry from the crisp outfit his mother had pressed for court. 2 guards yanked him out, their grips rough as they marched him through a sally port, the metal gates clanging shut with a finality that made his stomach lurch. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of bleach and despair, a sharp tang that stung his nostrils and clung to the back of his throat. The intake process began with a strip search in a cold, tiled room, the walls slick with condensation and grime. Malik stood shivering, his arms crossed over his chest as a guard barked, "Orders," his voice echoing off the concrete like gunfire. "Take it all off," the guard snapped, a stocky man with a shaved head and a sneer that curled his lips. Malik hesitated, his skin prickling with humiliation, but the guard's glare left no room for defiance. He peeled off the suit, piece by piece, until he stood bare under the flickering fluorescent lights, every inch of him exposed to the man's cold scrutiny. The guard circled him, his boots squeaking on the wet floor, then leaned in close, his breath hot with the smell of chewing tobacco. "You street trash think you're tough," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "We'll see how long that lasts in here." Malik's face burned, but he kept his eyes on the floor, biting back the retort that clawed at his throat. He'd heard enough stories to know talking back could get him hurt, or worse. The guard snorted, satisfied with Malik's silence, and tossed him a scratchy orange jumpsuit that smelled of mildew and someone else's sweat. "Put it on," he growled, "before I make you regret wasting my time." Malik dressed quickly, the coarse fabric scraping against his skin, and followed the guard. Down a narrow corridor lined with steel doors, the sounds of the jail assaulted him. A cacophony of metal doors slamming, distant shouting, and the low hum of despair that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Inmates peered out from behind bars as he passed, their eyes glinting with curiosity or menace, some whispering slurs under their breath while others just stared, sizing him up like prey. The guard led him to a cell block, a cavernous room filled with double bunks and the stench of unwashed bodies. Malik's new home was a 6x8 cage, its walls pocked with scratches and faded graffiti, the air heavy with the sour reek of mold. A wiry teen sat on the lower bunk, his knees drawn up to his chest, his dark skin marked with a jagged scar across his cheek. He looked up as Malik entered, his eyes wary but not hostile. "Name's Dre," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You new meat, huh?" Malik nodded, forcing his voice steady. "Yeah, Malik," he replied, climbing onto the top bunk with a mattress so thin he could feel the metal frame beneath. Dre glanced at the door, then back at Malik, his expression darkening. "Watch out for the guards round here," he warned. "Specially. That one with the tat, he's got a thing for teaching lessons." Malik frowned, about to ask what he meant when the cell block lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Hours later, Malik lay awake. The jail's night sounds a relentless assault on his nerves, when Dre's warning came to life. Heavy footsteps approached, deliberate and slow, and the cell door slid open with a screech that sent a jolt through Malik's spine. The guard Dre had mentioned stepped inside, a burly man with a Confederate flag tattoo snaking up his forearm, his eyes glinting with malice under the dim overhead light. He pointed a baton at Malik, his lips curling into a sneer that promised pain. "Get up, boy," he growled. "Time for your first lesson." Malik's heart slammed against his ribs, but he forced himself to sit up, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the bunk. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The guard didn't answer, just stepped closer, the baton tapping against his palm like a metronome counting down to violence. "You lookin' defiant," he snarled, "and I don't like that in my house." Before Malik could react, the guard grabbed him by the collar, yanking him off the bunk and dragging him out of the cell. Dre shrank back against the wall, his eyes wide with terror, whispering sorry under his breath as Malik was pulled into the corridor. The guard shoved him down a dimly lit hallway, past rows of cells where inmates watched in silence, their faces, pale shadows behind the bars. Malik stumbled, his bare feet slapping against the cold concrete until they reached a blind spot near the showers, a corner where the cameras didn't reach. The guard slammed him against the wall, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs, and pinned him there with a meaty forearm across his throat. "You think you're somebody, huh?" the guard hissed, his spit flecking Malik's cheek. "Think you can come in here and act like you belong?" Malik gasped for air, his hands scrabbling at the guard's arm, but the man's weight was unyielding, a mountain of hate pressing him into the damp tiles. "I didn't do anything," Malik choked out, his vision swimming with black spots. "I'm just trying to get through this." The guard laughed, a low guttural sound that sent a shiver down Malik's spine, and released his throat only to swing the baton in a vicious arc. It caught Malik in the ribs, a sharp crack of pain that doubled him over, his knees hitting the floor with a dull thud. The guard didn't stop, raining blows down on Malik's back, his shoulders, his legs, each strike accompanied by a snarl about teaching him his place. Malik curled into himself, arms shielding his head, the pain a white-hot blaze that consumed every thought. Blood filled his mouth, coppery and warm, from where he'd bitten his tongue, and his ribs screamed with every shallow breath. The beating seemed to last forever, each strike a lesson in brutality, until finally the guard stepped back, panting, his baton dripping with sweat and flecks of Malik's blood. "Stay down, boy," he growled, "or next time I won't stop." Malik lay there, his body a map of agony, as the guard's boots echoed away down the hall. The cold floor pressed against his cheek, grounding him as he fought to stay conscious, each breath a jagged knife in his side. He didn't know how long he stayed there, minutes or hours, but eventually another guard found him, a younger man with a pinched face who muttered curses under his breath as he hauled Malik to his feet. "You're lucky he didn't kill you," the guard said, half dragging him back to the cell. Malik didn't respond, his mind a haze of pain and defiance, the guard's words echoing in his skull. Lucky. There was nothing lucky about this place, nothing fair about the hate that seeped from its walls. Dre was awake when Malik stumbled back into the cell, his eyes wide with guilt as he helped Malik onto the lower bunk. "I told you to watch out," he whispered. But Malik just shook his head, the movement sending a fresh wave of pain through his battered body. He lay there, staring at the underside of the top bunk, the graffiti blurring into meaningless shapes as he forced himself to breathe through the agony. The guard's words, the baton's sting, the jail's suffocating weight, it all crystallized into a single burning truth. They wanted him broken, wanted him to crumble under their hate. But as Malik clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, he made a silent vow. He'd survive this for his mother, for his future, for the chance to prove them wrong. His ribs throbbed, his blood dried sticky on his lips, but his resolve hardened like steel in the dark. They could beat him, they could cage him, but they wouldn't break him, not yet. Malik Carter lay on the thin mattress of his cell bunk in Fulton County Jail, his bruised ribs throbbing with every shallow breath, the pain a constant reminder of the racist guard's baton from the night before. The cell's concrete walls seemed to close in around him, their pocked surface glistening with condensation under the dim overhead light, the air heavy with the stink of mold and despair. His orange jumpsuit clung to his skin, damp with sweat and the faint metallic tang of dried blood from his split lip. Sleep had eluded him, chased away by the echoes of the guard's sneers and the sharp cracks of pain that still lingered in his bones. He stared at the graffiti scratched into the underside of the top bunk, names and dates blurring together, a gallery of forgotten souls who'd been here before him. The jail was quieter now, the early morning hours bringing a tense stillness broken only by the occasional cough or shout from a distant cell. Malik's thoughts drifted to his mother, Shonda Carter, wondering if she'd slept at all since his arrest, picturing her pacing their small apartment in Atlanta, her nurse's scrubs still on, her face etched with worry. He needed to see her, needed to hear her voice, even if just for a moment to remind himself he wasn't as alone as this place made him feel. Around mid-morning, a new guard appeared at the cell door, a lanky man with a bored expression and a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Carter, visitor," he grunted, sliding the door open with a screech that set Malik's teeth on edge. Malik sat up slowly, wincing as his ribs protested, and followed the guard down a narrow corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry bees. His heart pounded with a fragile hope, the kind that felt dangerous to hold onto, but he couldn't help it. It had to be Shonda, had to be her coming to tell him she'd found a way to get him out of this hellhole. The visitor's booth was a cramped space with scratched glass partitions and chipped plastic chairs, the air stale with the lingering scent of disinfectant. Malik sat down, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the cool glass. And there, she was Shonda on the other side, her eyes bloodshot and shadowed, her braids pulled back in a messy bun. She wore her faded scrubs, the ones with a tiny tear at the hem she always meant to mend, and her hands gripped the edge of the booth's counter like she was anchoring herself to it. Malik grabbed the phone on his side of the glass, his fingers fumbling with the receiver as he pressed it to his ear. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I'm okay, I swear I'm okay." Shonda's eyes welled up, tears spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head, her own phone pressed so hard against her ear that her knuckles paled. "Baby, you don't look okay," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're not supposed to do this to you. None of this is right." Malik forced a small smile, though it felt more like a grimace, wanting to ease her pain even if he couldn't, ease his own. "I'm hanging in there," he said. "Just tell me what's going on out there." Shonda took a shaky breath, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and leaned closer to the glass. "I got through to your father," she said, her voice steadying with determination. "Terrence, he's working on it, Malik. He's pulling every string he can to get the library security footage that proves you were there, not at that damn liquor store." Malik's chest tightened, a flicker of hope igniting despite the weight of his reality. His father, Terrence Carter, the U.S. Attorney General, had the kind of power most people could only dream of, the kind of reach that could maybe, just maybe, cut through the corruption pinning Malik down. If they got that footage, if they could show he was nowhere near Peachtree Road when the robbery happened, then this nightmare might end. He nodded, clinging to Shonda's words like a lifeline. "That's good, Mom. That's real good," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just tell him to hurry. I don't know how much longer I can take this." Shonda's face softened, but her eyes burned with a fierce resolve. "He's not stopping, baby, not for a second," she said, pressing her palm against the glass as if she could reach through it and pull him to safety. Malik mirrored her, his own, hand shaking as he pressed it to the glass, the cool surface a cruel barrier between them. The guard at the door tapped his watch, signaling their time was nearly up, but Shonda held his gaze for a moment longer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You stay strong, Malik, you hear me? We're getting you out, I swear it." Malik nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he hung up the phone, watching her stand and walk away, her shoulders squared with a determination that made him ache with gratitude. The guard escorted him back to his cell, the corridor's fluorescent glare harsher now against the fragile hope blooming in his chest. He clung to Shonda's words, replaying them in his mind as he lay back on the bunk, the thin mattress doing little to ease the ache in his ribs. Terence was on it, the footage was coming, maybe even today. For the first time since his arrest, Malik allowed himself to imagine walking free, hugging his mother without glass between them, breathing air that didn't taste like despair. Hours later, the cell door screeched open again, and Malik's public defender, Ms. Ellis, stepped inside, her thin frame hunched with exhaustion, her cheap blouse wrinkled and her eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. But there was a spark in her expression, a flicker of something that made Malik sit up despite the pain lancing through his side. "We've got it," she said, her voice trembling with cautious excitement. "The library security footage. It's surfaced. This morning it shows you there studying, from 7 until 9 on the night of the robbery." Malik's breath caught, his heart slamming against his bruised ribs as a wave of relief crashed over him. He could see it now, the grainy video of him hunched over a table, surrounded by books, oblivious to the world outside. It was proof, real proof, the kind even Judge Hargrove couldn't ignore. He exhaled shakily, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the pain. "So what's next?" he asked, his voice raw with hope. "We show it to the judge, right?" Ms. Ellis nodded, clutching her file like a lifeline. "We're filing a motion to dismiss," she said. "I'll get it to the court by tomorrow. This could change everything, Malik." For the rest of the day, Malik clung to that promise, his mind spinning with visions of freedom, of walking out of this hellhole and into his mother's arms. He barely noticed the stale lunch tray pushed through the slot, the bread tasteless, but his appetite non-existent anyway. The other inmates' shouts and the guards' sneers faded into background noise, drowned out by the possibility of escape. He thought of his father, working tirelessly behind the scenes, a man whose power might finally outweigh the hate trying to crush him. That night, Malik lay on his bunk, staring at the graffiti above him, the names and dates no longer a gallery of despair but a reminder that he might not join them. Sleep tugged at him, a rare mercy, but just as he began to drift off, the cell door screeched open again, jolting him awake. The same racist guard from the beating, the one with the Confederate tattoo snaking up his forearm, stepped inside, his bulk filling the doorway, his eyes glinting with a malice that turned Malik's blood to ice. The guard leaned against the bars, his baton tapping lazily against his palm, a smirk twisting his lips. "Heard about your little footage, boy," he whispered, his voice low and venomous. "Shame it disappeared again. Precinct fire, they're saying. All that evidence just burned up." Malik's heart stopped, the fragile hope he'd nurtured all day shattering like glass against concrete. He sat up, ignoring the scream of his ribs, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "That's not possible," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and fury. "It was filed. It was safe." The guard chuckled, a sound that scraped against Malik's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "Things ain't safe when people want 'em gone," he said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over Malik like a storm cloud. "You think you're getting out of here? Think again." Malik stared at him, the weight of those words crushing what little light he'd found in this place. The footage, the one thing that could prove his innocence, gone in a fire that wasn't an accident, not by a long shot. He thought of his mother's tears, his father's promises, the courtroom that had already judged him guilty without a shred of real evidence. The guard's smirk widened as he turned to leave, his parting words a knife in Malik's gut. "Better get comfy, boy, you ain't going nowhere." The cell door slammed shut, the sound echoing in Malik's ears as he sank back onto the bunk, his hands trembling with rage and despair. The hope that had carried him through the day was ash now, burned away by the same corruption that had landed him here in the first place. He didn't know who had torched the footage, didn't know how deep this went, but one thing was clear. They weren't done with him yet, and whatever came next would be worse than anything he'd faced so far. Malik Carter sat on the edge of his bunk in Fulton County Jail, his bruised ribs still aching from the guard's beating days ago, the pain a dull throb that matched the steady drip of water from a cracked pipe in the cell's corner. The air was thick with the sour reek of mold and sweat, the dim light from a single bulb casting jagged shadows across the concrete walls. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, the fabric stiff with dried sweat and grime, a constant reminder. Jove, the filth this place seeped into everything. Since the racist guard had whispered about the fire that destroyed the library footage, Malik's hope had shriveled into a tight knot of dread, coiled in his chest like a snake waiting to strike. He hadn't slept more than a few fitful hours, his mind replaying the guard's smirk, the casual cruelty of it all, and the sinking realization that someone wanted him buried deeper than a jail cell could manage. The morning dragged on, the jail's routine a blur of shouted orders and the clanging of metal trays, but Malik barely touched the grey slop they called breakfast, his stomach too knotted to eat. Around noon, the cell door screeched open and a new guard appeared, a wiry man with a pinched face and a clipboard clutched in his bony hands. Carter. Interrogation room, now, he barked, his tone clipped and impatient. Malik frowned, his pulse quickening as he slid off the bunk, wincing at the stab of pain in his side. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse, but the guard just jerked his head toward the corridor, his expression blank. "Move it," he said. "I ain't got all day." Malik followed, his bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. Floor? The corridor's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry insects. The other inmates watched him pass, their eyes glinting with curiosity or indifference, some muttering under their breath, while others turned away, already, bored by the sight of another kid being dragged off to who knew what. The interrogation room was a windowless box at the end of the hall, its walls a sickly shade of green, the air stale with the lingering scent of cigarette smoke and mildew. A single metal table sat in the center, bolted to the floor, its surface, scratched with initials and curses, etched by countless others who'd sat here before him. 2 chairs faced each other across the table, one empty, the other occupied by the last person Malik wanted to see. Nathan Wells, the prosecutor who'd stood in court and painted him as a hardened criminal without a shred of real evidence. Wells looked out of place in the grimy room, his dark grey suit pressed and pristine, his pale skin gleaming under the harsh light, his slicked back hair giving him the polished sheen of a man who knew he held power. He sat back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his hands folded neatly in his lap, but his eyes were sharp, glinting with a predator's focus as Malik was pushed into the room. The guard shoved Malik into the empty chair, the metal, creaking under his weight, and then stepped back to stand by the door, his arms crossed like a sentinel. Wells gestured toward the seat with a lazy wave of his hand, his expression unreadable. "Have a seat, son," he said, his voice smooth as oil, the kind of tone that slipped under your skin and stayed there. Malik didn't move at first, his jaw clenching as he stared at the man who'd already tried to bury him in court. "I don't have anything to say to you," he said finally, his voice low but steady, his hands gripping the edge of the chair to keep them from shaking. Wells smirked, a faint curl of his lips that didn't reach his eyes, and leaned back further in his chair, his posture casual but coiled, like a snake waiting to strike. "That's fine," he said, exhaling dramatically as if this whole ordeal was some great burden on him. "You don't have to talk, you just have to listen." Malik hesitated, his instincts screaming to get up and walk out, but the guard's presence at the door kept him rooted in place. Slowly he sat down, the chair's cold metal biting into his thighs as he met Wells's gaze, refusing to look away even as his heart pounded against his bruised ribs. Wells exhaled again, a theatrical sigh that grated on Malik's nerves, and tilted his head slightly, studying him like a specimen under a microscope. "Look, kid," he began, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I know you think you're some innocent victim here, that this is all some big mistake." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, his smirk widening as he leaned forward slightly. "But mistakes don't just happen in a system like this. Things are the way they are for a reason." Malik's fists tightened under the table, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep his voice steady. "You mean because people like you make sure they stay that way," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them, raw and sharp with the anger that had been simmering since his arrest. Wells chuckled, a low, dry sound that sent a shiver down Malik's spine, and leaned back again, his eyes darkening with something colder than amusement. "See, you're smarter than you look," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You have a powerful father, Malik, a father who's made a lot of enemies, and in this world, when you step on too many toes, there are consequences." Malik's heart pounded harder, the implication sinking in like a stone in his gut. So this was about his father, Terence Carter, the U.S. Attorney General, a man who'd spent years taking down corrupt cops, prosecutors, even judges, stepping on every dirty toe in Washington along the way. Malik had always known his fathers. Work came with risks, but knowing it and living it were two different things, and now he was the collateral, the pawn in someone else's revenge game. Wells leaned forward again, his elbows resting on the table, his fingers steepled as he fixed Malik with a stare that felt like a blade against his throat. "Here's the deal," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "If you take the plea, you'll be out in a few years. Good behavior, maybe even less." He shrugged, a casual gesture that belied the weight of his words. "You'll get to move on, start fresh." Malik's stomach twisted, a sick feeling creeping up his spine as he processed the offer. 5 years for a crime he didn't commit. 5 years stolen from his life, his dreams of becoming a lawyer, his mother's hopes all traded for a lie. "And if I don't?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, forcing himself to meet Wells's gaze, even as dread coiled tighter in his chest. Wells's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as his voice dropped to a quiet menace that chilled Malik to the bone. "Then I make sure you never see the outside of a cell again," he said, tapping the table with one finger for emphasis. "We both know. The judge isn't on your side, the jury. They'll believe what I tell them to believe. You don't have any evidence left to prove your innocence, and I have a witness who says you did it." He paused, letting the threat sink in, then leaned back with a shrug, his tone lightening as if he hadn't just dangled a life sentence over Malik's head. "Do the smart thing, kid. Take the deal." Malik took a slow, steady breath, forcing himself to stay calm even as his body screamed with tension, every muscle taut with the urge to lash out. Wells wanted him to break, wanted him scared, desperate, weak, but Malik wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. He met Wells's gaze, his voice unwavering, despite the storm inside him. "I'm not admitting to something I didn't do," he said, each word deliberate, a quiet defiance that felt like the only weapon he had left. Wells' jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face for a split second before he masked it with another smirk, the kind that said he wasn't used to people saying no to him. He stood adjusting his suit with a casual flick of his wrists, but his eyes never left Malik's, the threat still lingering in their depths. "Suit yourself," he said, turning toward the door, but he paused just long enough to throw one last warning over his shoulder. "You'll regret it." The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing in the small room like a gunshot, leaving Malik alone with the guard, his whole body tense, his mind spinning with what had just happened. This was worse than he'd thought, not just corruption, but a deliberate campaign to destroy him, to use him as a weapon against his father. They didn't care about justice, didn't care about right or wrong, they just wanted to win, and Malik was the battlefield. The guard stepped forward, grabbing Malik's arm and yanking him to his feet, but Malik barely felt the grip, his thoughts too tangled in Wells' words, in the plea deal that wasn't a deal at all, but a trap. Back in his cell, the day dragged on, the weight of Wells' threat pressing down on him like a physical thing, but it was what happened that night that turned the knife deeper. Dre, his bunkmate, who'd been quiet since Malik returned, sat up on the lower bunk as the lights dimmed, his scarred face shadowed in the faint glow from the corridor. "Heard you got a visitor today," he said, his voice low, cautious, like he was testing the waters. Malik nodded, too tired to speak, his ribs aching as he shifted on the thin mattress. Dre hesitated, then leaned closer, his eyes darting to the cell door before he spoke again. "That prosecutor, Wells, he came to me too," he whispered. "Offered me early release if I said I heard you confess to the robbery." Malik froze, his breath catching in his throat as the words sank in, betrayal slicing through him like a blade. He sat up, ignoring the pain in his side, and stared at Dre, searching his face for a sign it was a lie. "You didn't," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell me you didn't." Dre looked away, his shoulders hunching with guilt, and that was answer enough. "I had to, man," he muttered. "I got a kid out there. I can't stay in here no more." Malik's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as the weight of Dre's words settled over him. Alone again, betrayed by the one person he'd thought he could trust in this hellhole, the one person who'd warned him about the guards, who'd shared the unspoken code of survival. Now Dre was just another weapon in Wells' arsenal, another lie to bury him deeper. Malik lay back down, staring at the graffiti above him, the names and dates blurring through the sting of unshed tears. Wells had played him, played Dre, played the whole damn system. And now Malik was more isolated than ever, with a fake confession waiting to seal his fate. He didn't know how much more he could take, didn't know if he could outlast this machine grinding him down. But one thing was clear. They weren't done with him yet, and whatever came next would cut deeper than any baton ever could. Malik Carter sat on the edge of his bunk in Fulton County Jail, the thin mattress sagging under his weight, his bruised ribs pulsing with a dull ache that hadn't faded since the guard's beating days ago. The cell's concrete walls loomed around him, their pocked surfaces slick with condensation, the air heavy with the sour stench of sweat and mold that clung to his orange jumpsuit like a second skin. His hands rested on his knees, still trembling from the sting of Dre's betrayal the night before. The bunkmate's whispered confession about selling him out to prosecutor Nathan Wells echoing in his skull like a relentless drumbeat. Malik hadn't spoken to Dre since, hadn't even looked at him. The silence between them a jagged wound that festered in the cramped 6x8 cage they shared. The jail hummed with its usual chaos, the clanging of metal doors and the shouts of inmates a constant backdrop, but now there was a new edge to the noise, a tension Malik could feel in his bones. Word had spread fast through the cell block about Dre's claim that Malik had confessed to the liquor store robbery, a lie bought with the promise of early release, and it hung over him like a storm cloud ready to burst. Malik kept his head down as the day wore on, avoiding eye contact with the other inmates during rec time, their stares prickling the back of his neck like needles. He knew how rumors worked in a place like this, how they twisted and grew until they became truth in the eyes of men, with nothing left to lose. By lunchtime, the whispers had turned into something uglier, something he couldn't ignore. Malik shuffled into the cafeteria, a cavernous room with peeling paint and long metal tables bolted to the floor, the air thick with the greasy smell of overcooked beans and stale bread. He grabbed a tray, his hand steady despite the knot in his stomach, and moved toward an empty spot at the end of a table, hoping to eat in peace. But peace wasn't on the menu. Halfway through the line, a group of inmates blocked his path. Their orange jumpsuits faded and patched, their faces hard with intent. At the front stood a man Malik hadn't seen before, a towering figure with a shaved head and a jagged scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw, his pale skin marked with crude tattoos of swastikas and crossed rifles. His name was Knox, Malik learned later, a leader among the jail's white supremacist gang, his presence a promise of violence that made the air crackle. Knox stepped forward, his boots squeaking on the scuffed linoleum, and spat a wad of tobacco, juice onto Malik's tray, the brown glob splattering across the bread with a wet smack. Malik froze, his pulse hammering in his ears as the cafeteria fell silent, every eye turning to watch the showdown unfold. Knox grinned, his teeth yellowed and uneven, and leaned in close, his breath sour with the stink of chew and malice. "Heard you're a big-time robber, boy," he sneered, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Thought you could come in here and play tough, huh?" Malik's hands tightened around the tray, his knuckles paling against his dark skin, but he kept his voice low, steady. "I didn't do it," he said, meeting Knox's gaze despite the fear clawing at his chest. "You got the wrong guy." Knox laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the walls, and the inmates behind him joined in, their jeers a chorus of hate that drowned out Malik's words. "Wrong guy?" Knox said, stepping closer until his shadow swallowed Malik's. "We don't. Like liars round here, especially not your kind. The slur that followed hit Malik like a punch, raw and ugly, a word he'd heard before, but never with such venom, never with a crowd egging it on. He glanced at the guards stationed near the walls, their arms crossed, their faces blank, but they didn't move, didn't blink, their indifference a silent approval of what was coming. Knox grabbed Malik's tray and smashed it to the floor, the plastic clattering against the linoleum as beans and bread scattered like shrapnel. Malik stepped back, his heart racing, but there was nowhere to go, the gang closing in like wolves circling a wounded deer. Later that day, during the evening rec time, the real attack came. Malik stood near the showers, the tiled walls slick, with steam and grime, the air humid with the faint scent of bleach and rust. He'd kept his distance from Dre, from everyone, but Knox and his crew had been watching, waiting for their moment. They cornered him as he turned a blind corner, the gang moving as one, their footsteps silent but deliberate on the wet floor. Knox loomed in front, a shiv glinting in his fist, the blade a dull gleam under the flickering lights, its edge jagged. From being sharpened on concrete, Malik's breath caught, his body tensing as he backed against the wall, the cold tiles biting into his spine. "You think you're safe in here, boy?" Knox growled, twirling the shiv with a practiced ease. "Think, your fancy daddy's gonna swoop in and save you." Malik's mind raced, the mention of his father, Terence Carter, sending a jolt through him, proof that this wasn't random, that Wells or someone higher had spread the word about who he was, what he meant. "I don't want trouble," Malik said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Just let me be." Knox sneered, stepping closer, the shiv inches from Malik's chest. "Trouble found you," he said, "and we're gonna finish it." Before Malik could dodge, Knox lunged, the blade slicing toward his gut, a flash of steel aimed to kill. Malik reacted, on instinct, twisting to the side, the shiv grazing his arm instead, a hot line of pain that made him gasp as blood welled up, soaking the sleeve of his jumpsuit. The sting fueled him, adrenaline drowning out the fear, and he swung wildly, his fist connecting with Knox's nose with a wet crunch. Blood sprayed, Knox staggering back with a howl, his free hand clutching his face as crimson streamed between his fingers. The gang hesitated, stunned by the hit, and Malik seized the moment, shoving past them, his feet slipping on the wet tiles as he bolted for the open corridor. He didn't get far. The guards finally moved, their boots pounding the floor as they swarmed in, not to help but to punish. They tackled Malik, slamming him face first into the concrete, their knees digging into his back as he struggled to breathe, the taste of blood and dust filling his mouth. Knox and his crew melted back into the shadows, the shiv gone, their hands clean as the guards hauled Malik to his feet, his arm dripping red onto the floor. "You started this," one guard snarled, a lie so blatant it burned, and Malik knew they'd seen it all, had let it happen. They dragged him to solitary, a pitch black box no bigger than a closet, the air frigid and stale, the walls rough with unseen scratches. Rats skittered in the corners, their tiny claws a faint scratch against the silence as the door slammed shut, plunging him into darkness. Malik sank to the floor, his knees pulled to his chest, the cold seeping into his bones as the cut on his arm throbbed, sticky with clotting blood. His ribs ached, his face stung from the tackle, but it was his mind that hurt most, spinning with the gang's hate, the guards' complicity, the betrayal that had painted a target on his back. He shivered, the darkness pressing in like a living thing, every sound amplified, every shadow a threat. The jail wasn't just a cage anymore, it was a battlefield, and Malik was losing ground fast. Knox's words echoed in his head, the mention of his father, a taunt that cut deeper than the shiv, proof this was bigger than him, bigger than a fake robbery charge. He didn't know how he'd survive solitary, didn't know if he could outlast the hate closing in from every side, but he clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, and forced himself to breathe. They wanted him broken, wanted him bleeding, out in the shadows, but he wouldn't give them that, not yet. The rats scratched louder, the cold bit deeper, and Malik's resolve hardened, a flicker of defiance in the dark that refused to die. Malik Carter emerged from solitary confinement after 3 endless days in Fulton County Jail, his body stiff from the cold concrete floor, his arm still throbbing from the shiv's graze, now crusted with dried blood beneath a ragged bandage. The pitch-black box had left him raw, the skittering rats and suffocating darkness gnawing at his sanity, but he'd clung to a stubborn spark of defiance, whispering his mother's name in the dark to keep from breaking. The cell block's fluorescent light stung his eyes as a guard shoved him back into the general population, the air thick with the familiar stench of sweat and mold, the orange jumpsuit clinging to his skin like a damp shroud. His ribs ached. With every step, a lingering echo of the guard's baton and the gang's attack, but he forced himself upright, refusing to let them see how close he'd come to crumbling. The other inmates watched him return, their stares a mix of curiosity and menace, whispers trailing him like shadows as he shuffled to his bunk. Dre avoided his gaze, hunched on the lower mattress, his scarred face turned away, the betrayal between them a silent wall that neither dared to breach. Malik climbed onto the top bunk, the thin mattress creaking under his weight, and lay there staring at the graffiti scratched above him, names and dates blurring into a testament of survival he wasn't sure he'd join. Hours later, a guard barked his name, Carter, visitor, his voice cutting through the cell block's hum, and Malik's heart leapt despite the exhaustion weighing him down. He followed the guard to the visitor's booth, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor, hope flickering fragile and dangerous in his chest. It had to be his mother, Shonda, with news from his father, Terence Carter, something to pull him out of this abyss. The booth's scratched glass partition loomed ahead, and there she was, Shonda, her eyes shadowed with sleepless nights, her faded scrubs wrinkled, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the glass. Malik grabbed the phone, his fingers unsteady, and pressed it to his ear, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Mum, what's happening?" Shonda's lips quivered, but her gaze burned with a fierce determination that steadied him. "Your father found something," she said, her words rushed but clear. "A librarian from that night. She's willing to testify you were there studying when the robbery went down." Malik's breath caught, a rush of relief flooding through him, washing away the grime of solitary for a fleeting moment. A witness, a real person who'd seen him, not just grainy footage that could vanish in a convenient fire. He pictured the library, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the stack of debate notes he'd been poring over, and now someone could vouch for it, could prove he wasn't the thug they'd painted him to be. "That's it, Mum," he said, his voice cracking with a smile he couldn't hold back. "That's what we need, right?" Shonda nodded, her own smile tentative but real, pressing her palm harder against the glass. "Terence is getting her statement locked down," she said. "She's solid, Malik. She's not backing out. We're pushing this to the judge soon." Malik mirrored her, his hand shaking as it pressed against the glass, the cool surface a lifeline to the world outside. For the first time, in days, he felt lighter, the weight of the jail's hate lifting just enough to let him breathe. He imagined walking free, hugging Shonda without this barrier, proving to Wells and Hargrove and every sneering guard that they couldn't bury him. The guard tapped his watch, ending the visit too soon, but Shonda's last words lingered as she stood. "We're close, baby, hold on," she whispered, and Malik nodded, clinging to that promise as he was led back to his cell. The rest of the day passed in a haze, Malik's spirits soaring despite the ache in his ribs and the cut on his arm. He barely noticed the stale dinner tray, the bread dry and tasteless, his mind too busy replaying Shonda's words, the librarian's face he couldn't quite picture, but knew was his ticket out. He lay on his bunk that night, staring at the graffiti with new eyes, daring to believe he might not add his name to its roster of despair. Sleep came easier, a rare mercy. His dreams, filled with sunlight and his mother's laughter, instead of rats and steel bars. Days later, the pre-trial hearing arrived, and Malik was marched into the Atlanta courtroom, his borrowed suit swapped for a fresh one Shonda had sent, the fabric stiff but clean against his skin. The room buzzed with tension, the gallery packed. With onlookers, their whispers a low hum as Malik took his place beside Ms. Ellis, his public defender, her thin file dwarfed by the prosecutor's stack. Judge Evelyn Hargrove sat at the bench, her gaunt face as cold as ever, her icy blue eyes flicking over Malik with a smirk that made his stomach twist. Nathan Wells stood across the aisle, his wiry frame coiled with confidence, his predator's grin sharper than before. Ms. Ellis rose, her voice trembling but firm, announcing the new witness, a librarian named Ms. Clara Thompson, who'd sworn under oath that Malik was at the library from 7 until closing on the night of the robbery. Malik's heart pounded, his hands gripping the table as Ms. Ellis submitted the affidavit, the paper a beacon of truth in a sea of lies. The courtroom murmured, a ripple of surprise spreading through the crowd, and Malik felt victory close, a taste of freedom so real he could almost touch it. But Wells stood then, smoothing his jacket with a flourish, his smirk widening as he produced a thick sheaf of papers from his stack. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and cutting, "we have library logs from that night recently recovered showing the defendant left at 7:30, well before the robbery at 8:30. Malik's breath stopped, his eyes widening as Wells laid the logs on the table, their neat rows of numbers a damning contradiction to the librarian's story. Ms. Ellis stammered, flipping through her file, but she had nothing to counter it, her voice faltering as she objected weakly about authenticity. Hargrove leaned forward, her smirk deepening into something triumphant, and waved a hand dismissively. "These logs are admissible," she said, her tone flat. "The witness's statement is inconsistent. Proceed." Malik's hope cracked. A fracture, spidering through the fragile light he'd built, but the real blow came next. Wells cleared his throat, his eyes glinting with malice, and called Ms. Thompson to the stand as a surprise witness for the prosecution. The librarian entered, her grey hair tied back, her face pale and drawn, her hands twisting in her lap as she took the oath. Malik stared, confusion turning to dread as she avoided his gaze, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I was mistaken," she said, her words halting. "I thought it was that night, but I got the dates mixed up. He wasn't there. I'm sorry." The courtroom erupted, gasps and whispers drowning out Ms. Ellis's frantic objections, and Malik's world tilted, the air sucked from his lungs as the librarian's recantation tore his lifeline apart. Hargrove banged her gavel, silencing the chaos, and turned to Malik with a sneer that chilled his blood. "Given this testimony," she said, "the trial date is set for next week. The defendant remains in custody." Malik's knees buckled, the officers grabbing his arms to steady him, their grips bruising as they pulled him from the stand. Shonda's cry echoed from the gallery, a desperate wail that cut through him, but he couldn't look at her, couldn't face the pain mirrored in her eyes. Back in his cell, Malik sat numbly on the bunk, the weight of the hearing crushing him, the clean suit now a mockery of the hope he'd dared to feel. Hours later, Shonda uncovered the truth, piecing it together through a frantic call to a friend at the library. The librarian's family had received death threats, calls traced to a burner phone near Wells's office, a shadow of intimidation that had forced her to lie. Malik learned this from a scribbled note Shonda slipped through a guard, the paper trembling in his hands as he read it, rage and despair warring in his chest. The logs were doctored, the witness coerced, and Hargrove had let it happen, her sneer, a stamp of approval on the corruption eating him alive. He crumpled the note, his nails digging into his palms, the cut on his arm pulsing with fresh pain as he stared at the graffiti above him. Another victory snatched away, another blow harder than the last, and now a trial loomed, a rigged fight. He wasn't sure he could win. Shonda's note ended with a vow, "We're not giving up." But Malik felt the walls closing in tighter, the system's jaws snapping shut around him, and he didn't know how much fight he had left. Malik Carter sat on the edge of his bunk in Fulton County Jail, the thin mattress sagging beneath him, his bruised ribs a constant ache that pulsed with every shallow breath he took. The cell's concrete walls loomed closer than ever, their pocked surfaces glistening with condensation, the air thick with the sour reek of mold and unwashed bodies that clung to his orange jumpsuit like a second skin. His arms still throbbed from the shiv's graze, the bandage peeling at the edges, sticky with dried blood, a reminder of the gang's attack that had landed him in solitary days ago. Since the pre-trial hearing, where the librarians coerced, recantation and Nathan Wells's doctored logs had crushed his latest hope. Malik's world had shrunk to this 6x8 cage, the weight of a rigged trial pressing down on him like a stone on his chest. Dre avoided him, hunched on the lower bunk, his scarred face turned away, the betrayal between them a silent poison that festered in the cramped space. The jail's routine dragged on. The clanging of metal doors and the shouts of inmates a dull roar in Malik's ears, but something new simmered beneath it, a tension he couldn't place until it exploded into the open. Days after the hearing, the cell block buzzed with fresh rumors, whispers that slithered through the bars like smoke, and Malik caught fragments from the inmates passing by his cell. "They're talking about you out there," one muttered, grinning, with yellowed teeth, saying you're some gangbanger gone wild. Malik frowned, his pulse quickening, but he kept his head down, hoping it was just jailhouse gossip blown out of proportion. That hope died when a guard tossed a crumpled newspaper through the bars during lunch, the pages landing at Malik's feet with a soft thud. He unfolded it, his hands trembling as he scanned the headline splashed across the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's front page: "Violent gang recruit caught in liquor store heist." Below it, a grainy photo of Malik stared back, his school ID picture twisted into something sinister, doctored to show him holding a gun, his face shadowed with a menacing glare that wasn't his own. The article, penned by some hack reporter, claimed Malik Carter, 17, was a rising star in a local gang, his arrest a triumph for law enforcement after a spree of armed robberies. Malik's stomach dropped, bile rising in his throat as he read the lies, each word a knife twisting deeper. He wasn't a gangbanger, wasn't a criminal. He was a kid who'd been at the library dreaming of law school when this nightmare began, but none of that mattered now. Nathan Wells had leaked this. He knew it in his bones, the prosecutor's smirk from their last meeting flashing in his mind, a promise of destruction beyond the courtroom. The newspaper slipped from his hands, fluttering to the floor as inmates nearby jeered, banging on their bars with metal cups, their shouts a chorus of hate that echoed through the block. "Look at the big shot," one yelled. "Think you're tough now, huh?" Malik sank back onto the bunk, his hands clenching into fists, nails digging into his palms as the noise battered him, a public execution of his name before the trial even started. Outside the jail, the smear campaign took root fast, its poison spreading through Atlanta like wildfire. By evening, local news stations ran the story, their anchors reciting Wells' lies with grim faces, flashing that doctored photo on loop, as if it were gospel. Protests erupted outside the jail's barbed wire fence, a chaotic mob of voices shouting for justice, but not for Malik, against him. Signs bobbed in the crowd, crude letters scrawled in red paint: "Lock him up for life, no mercy for thugs." Malik heard the chants through the jail's thick walls, faint but piercing, a roar that drowned out the last shred of dignity he'd clung to. The guards smirked as they patrolled the halls, one pausing by Malik's cell to whistle low. "Guess you're famous now, boy," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Better watch your back out there." Malik didn't respond, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the graffiti above him, the names and dates a blur through the sting of unshed tears. The world outside had turned on him, swallowing Wells' lies whole, and he was powerless to stop it, trapped behind bars while his name was dragged through the mud. The fallout hit harder than he'd expected, reaching beyond the jail's walls to strike at his family. 2 days later, Shonda Carter arrived for a visit, her face drawn and pale, her eyes red from crying, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the scratched glass partition in the visitor's booth. Malik grabbed the phone, his heart sinking. At the sight of her, her faded scrubs replaced with a plain jacket, her braids unraveling at the ends. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice cracking, dread coiling in his gut. Shonda swallowed hard, her lips quivering as she spoke. "They hit my car last night," she said, her words barely above a whisper, smashed the windows, spray-painted slurs. "All over it. Called me a thug's mom right there in our driveway." Malik's breath stopped, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead as her words sank in. His mother, the woman who'd worked double shifts to keep him fed, who'd fought for him every step of this hell, now a target because of him, because of Wells's lies. "That's not all," she continued, her voice breaking. "The hospital suspended me today, said the protests and the news made me a liability. They're scared of the backlash." Malik's hands shook, the phone slipping in his grip as rage and guilt warred in his chest. Shonda, the steadiest person he knew, was crumbling under this, her job gone, her safety shattered, all because someone wanted him destroyed. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he choked out, pressing his palm to the glass. "I didn't mean for this to touch you. Shonda shook her head, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "This ain't your fault, baby," she said, her voice steadying. "It's them. It's all them, but I'm not giving up. Your father's digging deeper. We'll fix this." The guard tapped his watch, cutting their time short, but Shonda's last words lingered as she stood. "Stay strong, Malik, we're still fighting," she said, and he nodded, clinging to her resolve as he was led back to his cell. The news spread. Through the jail like a virus, inmates banging on their bars as Malik passed, their chants shifting from mockery to threats. "You're done, Carter," one shouted. "Your whole family's trash now." Malik kept his head down, his fists clenched, the noise a relentless assault that drowned out Shonda's promise. That night, a guard slipped a folded note through the bars, the paper rough against Malik's fingers as he unfolded it, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. The handwriting was shaky, unmistakably Shonda's, and the message was short but brutal. "Your family's next," it read, scrawled in red ink beneath her plea to hold on. Malik's blood ran cold, the words a death knell that echoed Wells's threat from their meeting. Proof this wasn't just about him anymore, it was about tearing down everything he loved. He crumpled the note, his nails digging into his palms, until they drew blood, the cut on his arm pulsing with fresh pain as he stared at the graffiti above him. The jail's walls rattled with the inmates' chants, a symphony of hate that matched the protests outside, and Malik felt the isolation close in tighter, a noose tightening around his neck. Shonda's car, her job, now a threat to her life, all because Wells had turned him into a monster in the public's eyes. He didn't know who'd sent the note, didn't know how far this would go, but one thing was clear. The system wasn't just locking him up, it was erasing him, piece by piece, and dragging his family down with him. Malik lay back on the bunk, his chest heaving with suppressed rage, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. How could he protect Shonda from here? How could he fight a lie that had already won? The trial loomed closer, a rigged battlefield he was losing before it began, and he didn't know if Terrence's digging would be enough to stop the avalanche burying them all. Malik Carter stood in the Atlanta courtroom, his wrists chafed from fresh cuffs, the borrowed suit Shonda had sent now wrinkled and damp with sweat from the humid summer air seeping through the building's old walls. The trial had begun, a week after the pre-trial hearing's crushing blow, and the room buzzed with a restless energy. The gallery packed with onlookers whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes boring into Malik like needles. The wooden benches creaked under their weight, the air thick with the scent of polished oak and nervous tension, every sound amplified in the cavernous space. Malik's ribs still ached from the jail's brutal lessons, the shiv's graze on, his arm a faint throb beneath a clean bandage, but he stood tall, forcing his trembling legs to hold him steady. Judge Evelyn Hargrove presided from her towering bench, her gaunt face etched with the same icy smirk she'd worn since his arraignment, her grey hair pulled back tight, her blue eyes glinting with a cold certainty that chilled Malik's blood. Nathan Wells sat at the prosecution table, his wiry frame coiled with confidence, his dark suit pristine against the courtroom's faded backdrop, his predator's grin sharper than ever as he shuffled a thick stack of papers. Malik's hope rested on his father, Terrence Carter, who'd taken over as lead counsel, a decision announced days ago that had sent a ripple of shock through the jail's rumor mill. Terrence stood beside Malik now, his broad shoulders squared in a crisp navy suit, his face a mask of calm control, but Malik knew him well enough to spot the anger simmering beneath, a quiet fury in the set of his jaw. Ms. Ellis, the overworked public defender, had stepped aside, her thin file handed over to Terrence with a mix of relief and defeat in her shadowed eyes. Malik glanced at Shonda in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her faded jacket a stark contrast to the polished suits around her, her eyes red but fierce with a mother's unyielding faith. The trial opened with Terrence's voice cutting through the room, steady and commanding, a lifeline Malik clung to as the proceedings began. "Your Honor," he said, rising with a folder in hand, "the defense presents recovered library logs from the night of July 12th, showing my client was present from 7 until 9, corroborated by a new eyewitness, a homeless man who saw the real robber, a white male, flee the scene at 8:30. Malik's heart slammed against his bruised ribs, a surge of hope flooding through him. as Terence laid the logs on the table, their neat rows of numbers a beacon of truth against Wells's lies. The eyewitness, a grizzled man named Eddie Jones, shuffled into the courtroom, his tattered coat hanging loose on his thin frame, his grey beard patchy but his gaze steady as he took the stand. "I saw him clear as day," Eddie said, his voice rough but firm. "White guy, skinny, ran out the back with a bag. Wasn't no kid like this one." The courtroom buzzed, a murmur of surprise rippling through the crowd, and Malik felt victory close, a taste of freedom so vivid he could almost breathe the fresh air outside. Terence pressed forward, his tone sharp as he questioned Eddie, drawing out details, the red hoodie the robber wore, the screech of tires as he fled, every word painting a picture that didn't match Malik's face. Shonda's shoulders relaxed slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and Malik dared to believe they'd finally turned the tide, that his father's power could break through the corruption strangling him. But Hargrove's smirk didn't waver, her icy gaze flicking between Terence and Wells like she was waiting for something, and Malik's hope faltered, a crack forming in the fragile light he'd built. Wells stood then, smoothing his jacket with a flourish, his grin widening as he addressed the bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and cutting, "the defense's so-called evidence lacks proper chain of custody. These logs could have been altered, and this witness," he paused, glancing at Eddie with mock pity, "is unreliable, a transient with a history of petty theft, hardly credible." Malik's breath hitched, his hands gripping the table as Wells laid out his attack, each word a hammer chipping away at their case. Terence objected, his voice rising with controlled fury. The logs were secured from the library's backup system, independently verified, and the witness's account aligns perfectly with the timeline. Hargrove leaned forward, her smirk deepening into something triumphant, and waved a hand dismissively, silencing Terence mid-sentence. "I agree with the prosecution," she said, her tone flat and rehearsed. "The chain of custody is questionable, and the witness lacks credibility. The evidence is stricken from the record." Malik's world tilted, the air sucked from his lungs as the courtroom murmured. A mix of gasps and nods from the gallery, Shonda's faint cry drowned out by the noise. Terence's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. But he held his tongue, his eyes burning with a rage Malik knew he couldn't unleash, not yet. The logs, the witness, the truth, all buried under Hargrove's gavel with a single flick of her wrist, and Malik felt the noose tighten, the system's jaws snapping shut around him once more. Wells wasn't done, his grin stretching wider as he produced a surprise witness, a move so sudden it caught even Terence off guard. "The prosecution calls Officer James Tate to the stand," he announced, and a burly cop strode into the courtroom, his uniform crisp, his buzz cut gleaming under the lights, his face set in a smug certainty that made Malik's stomach twist. Tate took the oath, his meaty hand resting on the Bible, and turned to the jury, his voice steady as he delivered the lie that would seal Malik's fate. "I transported the defendant from the precinct after his arrest," he said, "and he confessed. To me in the van, bragged about the robbery, said he'd do it again if he got the chance." Malik's blood ran cold, his hands shaking as he shot to his feet, the words bursting out before he could stop them. "That's a lie. I never said that. I never even talked to him." The courtroom erupted, the gallery buzzing with shock. But Hargrove banged her gavel, her icy eyes pinning Malik with a glare that silenced him mid-breath. "Sit down, Mr. Carter," she snapped, "or I'll hold you in contempt the prosecution's witness stands." Malik sank back into his chair, his chest heaving, his eyes darting to Terence, who gripped his shoulder with a steady hand, whispering to stay calm. "We'll fight this." But the damage was done. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mix of doubt and belief, some nodding at Tate's words, others glancing at Malik with fresh suspicion, the lie sinking in like poison. Miss Ellis, hovering behind Terence, flipped through her notes uselessly, her trembling hands betraying her panic, while Wells sat back, his smirk a quiet triumph that screamed he'd won this round. Hargrove allowed the testimony, her voice cutting through the chaos as she addressed the court. "The prosecution's evidence is admissible," she said. "The trial will proceed. Jury deliberations to begin tomorrow." Malik's knees buckled, the officers, steadying him with bruising grips as they prepared to drag him back to jail, the weight of Tate's lie crushing the hope Terence had built. Shonda's sob echoed from the gallery, a sound that tore at Malik's heart, but he couldn't look at her, couldn't face the despair mirrored in her eyes. Terence leaned in close, his voice low and fierce as the officers pulled Malik away. "We're appealing this, son, every damn ruling. Hold on," he said. But the words felt hollow, a promise stretched thin against the machine grinding Malik down. Back in his cell, Malik sank onto the bunk, the concrete walls closing in tighter, the air stale with the stench of defeat. Dre avoided him still, his silence a reminder of the betrayal that had started this spiral, but Malik barely noticed, his mind replaying Tate's lie, Hargrove's smirk, the jury's shifting gazes. The logs, the witness all struck down with a flick of her wrist, and now a fake confession to seal his fate, a story so blatant it burned with the audacity of its falsehood. He thought of Shonda's vandalized car, her lost job, the note threatening, her life and now this. A trial rigged from the start, a battlefield where truth didn't matter, only power did. Terence's vow to appeal echoed in his head, a faint lifeline he clung to, but time was running out, the jury's decision looming like a guillotine over his neck. Malik clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, the cut on his arm pulsing, with fresh pain as he stared at the graffiti above him. Another near win obliterated, another blow harder than the last, and he didn't know if he could outlast this, didn't know if his father's fight could pierce the corruption choking him alive. Malik Carter sat on the edge of his bunk in Fulton County Jail, the thin mattress creaking under his weight, his bruised ribs a persistent ache that flared with every breath he drew. The cell's concrete walls loomed around him, their pocked surfaces slick with condensation, the air heavy with the sour stench of mold and despair that clung to his orange jumpsuit like a damp shroud. His arm throbbed beneath a peeling bandage, the shivs grazed from Knox's attack, a dull pulse of pain, a scar among many from the jail's relentless brutality. Since the trial's opening day, where Judge Hargrove had buried his father's evidence and let a cop's lie stand, Malik's world had shrunk to a tight knot of dread, coiled in his chest like a trap ready to spring. The jury was deliberating, now their decision, a looming shadow over his fate, and he awaited sentencing with a numbness that had settled into his bones. Dre stayed silent on the lower bunk, his scarred face turned away, the betrayal between them, a festering wound neither acknowledged. The jail hummed with its usual chaos, metal doors clanging and inmates shouting, but Malik barely heard it, his mind replaying the courtroom's collapse, Hargrove's smirk, Wells' triumph, the jury's shifting eyes. He'd survived beatings, a shiv solitary, a smear campaign, but each blow left him weaker, the fight draining from him drop by drop. 2 days after the trial's start, the routine shifted, a subtle change Malik didn't notice until it was too late. Lunch came as usual, a guard sliding a tray through the slot, the plastic rattling against the bars with a hollow clack. The food was the same grey slop, a watery stew with chunks of something unidentifiable, a stale roll, a cup of lukewarm water, all tasting of defeat. Malik forced it down, his stomach twisting with hunger he couldn't ignore, the roll crumbling, dry in his mouth as he chewed. He sat back on the bunk, the tray balanced on his knees, staring at the graffiti scratched above him, names and dates blurring into a gallery of lost souls he feared he'd join. Minutes passed, the cell block's noise a dull roar, when a sharp cramp twisted his gut, sudden and fierce, doubling him over with a gasp that caught in his throat. Sweat broke out across his forehead, cold and clammy as nausea surged, a bitter taste flooding his mouth. He stumbled to his feet, the tray clattering to the floor, and lurched toward the bars, his hands gripping the metal as his vision swam, with black spots. "Help!" he croaked, his voice weak. "Somebody get help!" Dre shot up, his eyes wide with panic, banging on the bars with his fists. "Guard! He's sick! Get over here!" he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency Malik hadn't expected. After their rift, the pain sharpened, a knife twisting in his stomach, and Malik sank to his knees, vomiting violently onto the concrete, the stew splattering dark and rancid, his body shaking as he retched again and again. Inmates in nearby cells joined the clamor, Their shouts a chaotic chorus that echoed through the block. But the guards were slow to respond, their boots dragging as if this were just another annoyance. Malik's hands clawed at the floor, his nails scraping against the cold stone as his strength bled away. His breath shallow and ragged. His vision blurred, the cell tilting around him, and he collapsed, his cheek pressed to the sticky concrete, the world fading to a haze of pain and darkness. Voices shouted, hands grabbed him, but it was all distant. A muffled roar as he slipped toward oblivion. He didn't know how long he lay there, minutes or hours, but awareness returned in fragments, the sharp sting of an IV in his arm, the sterile smell of antiseptic cutting through the jail stench, the faint beep of a machine tracking his pulse. Malik opened his eyes, his head pounding, and found himself in the jail's infirmary, a narrow room with cracked white walls and a single barred window letting in slivers of grey light. A nurse stood over him, a black woman with tight braids and a pinched face, her hands deft as she adjusted the IV line dripping fluid into his vein. "You're lucky," she said, her voice low but firm. "That poison nearly took you out, got you here just in time." Malik's throat burned, his voice a rasp as he forced the words out. "Poison?" he croaked, his mind struggling to catch up. "What do you mean, poison?" The nurse glanced at the door, her eyes darting to the guard stationed outside, then leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Someone slipped it in your food," she said. "I know who ordered it. Seen this before, but I can't say more, not here." Malik's blood ran cold, the word poison sinking in like a stone, his heart slamming against his bruised ribs as the implications hit. This wasn't an accident, not a random illness. Someone had tried to kill him, to silence him, before the jury could decide his fate. He thought of Wells's threat, the note slipped to him about his family, the relentless campaign to bury him, and now this, a step beyond framing into murder. The nurse stepped back, her expression hardening as the guard peered through the door's small window, and she busied herself with a clipboard, avoiding Malik's gaze. He lay there, the IV cold in his arm, his body trembling with a mix of rage and fear, the infirmary's stark light casting long shadows across the cracked floor. Hours later, Terence Carter arrived, his broad frame filling the doorway, his navy suit crisp despite the late hour, his face etched with a fury Malik hadn't seen since the trial's collapse. Shonda trailed behind, her eyes red and swollen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her faded jacket hanging loose on her shoulders. Malik sat up, wincing as his ribs protested, the IV tugging at his skin as he reached for them through the glass partition. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking, "they tried to kill me." Terence's jaw tightened, his hands pressing against the glass, his voice low and steady despite the storm in his eyes. "I know, son," he said. "We got the tray. Tested. Found traces of rat poison untraceable to the kitchen. Someone new slipped it in." Malik's stomach twisted, the memory of the stew's bitter taste flooding back, and he glanced at Shonda, her sob muffled by the glass, but piercing all the same. Terence leaned closer, his tone fierce with determination. "I traced it," he said. "A shell company tied to Hargrove's brother, a fixer for Atlanta's elite. They're desperate to stop us, but I'm not letting this go." Malik's breath caught, the name Hargrove a jolt through his battered body. Proof the judge wasn't just biased but complicit, her family's hands dirty with the blood they'd tried to spill. Shonda pressed her palm to the glass, her voice trembling but resolute. "You're alive, baby, that's what matters," she said. "We're fighting harder now, they won't win." The guard tapped his watch, cutting their time short, but Terence's last words lingered as he stood. "We're exposing them, Malik, every damn one," he said. "Hold on, we're close." Malik nodded, clinging to that vow as he was led back to the infirmary bed, the sterile air a stark contrast to the cell's filth. He lay there, ribs screaming, arm pulsing, his body a map of survival etched in pain, but his mind sharpened with a new resolve. The poison hadn't killed him. The nurse's quick hands had saved him, and now he knew the stakes, knew Hargrove and Wells weren't just playing a game, but waging a war to erase him. He thought of the trial, the jury's deliberation, the fake confession still hanging over him, and now this, an attempt on his life that screamed their desperation. Terence's revelation about Hargrove's brother spun in his head. A thread of corruption tying the judge to the poison, to the lies, to the machine grinding him down. Malik clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, the IV line tugging at his skin as he stared at the cracked ceiling. He'd survived beatings. A shiv, solitary, a smear campaign, and now this. Each blow harder than the last, but he was still breathing, still fighting. The infirmary's beep steadied his pulse, a rhythm of defiance that refused to flatline. And he vowed to hold on for Shonda's tears, for Terence's fury, for the chance to see this through. They wanted him dead, wanted him silenced, but Malik's resolve hardened. A steel core forged in the fire of their hate, and he wouldn't break, not yet. Malik Carter lay on a cot in the Fulton County Jail infirmary, his bruised ribs throbbing with every shallow breath. The IV line, tugging at his arm, where the nurse had saved him from the poison, slipped into his meal days ago. The room's cracked white walls gleamed under stark fluorescent lights, the air sharp with antiseptic that barely masked the jail's underlying stench of mold and despair. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, stained with sweat and the faint rust of dried blood from the shiv's graze, a constant reminder of the violence stalking him. Since the assassination attempt, Malik's world had narrowed to this sterile limbo, the jury's deliberation a ticking clock over his fate. His body a battered shell holding onto a flicker of defiance. The trial had stalled, Terence Carter's appeal against Hargrove's rulings buying time, but Malik felt the noose tightening, the system's jaws poised to snap shut. Dre's betrayal, the gang's attack, the smear campaign, the poison, each blow had carved away at him, but he clung to Shonda's tears and Terence's fury, a lifeline in the dark. Days after the poisoning, word reached Malik through a guard's gruff announcement, "Carter, your old man's stirring the pot out there. Better hope it don't boil over on you." Malik's pulse quickened, his mind racing with what Terence might have done. The U.S. Attorney General's power a double-edged sword that could cut through corruption or draw more blood. That evening, the jail's TV, bolted high in the common area, flickered to life during rec time, and Malik caught the news from his infirmary bed through the open door. The sound faint, but piercing. A local anchor's voice crackled through, static, reporting a bombshell affidavit leaked to the press, tying Judge Evelyn Hargrove to a white supremacist donor funding her campaigns, a man with ties to Atlanta's elite and a history of bankrolling hate groups. Malik's breath caught, his hands clenching the cot's thin sheet as the anchor detailed Terence's move. Federal investigators now sniffing around Hargrove's finances, the leak a calculated strike to expose her bias. Protests swelled outside the courthouse, a roar of voices demanding Malik's release, their chants filtering through the jail's thick walls, a distant thunder that shook the air. Signs flashed on the screen. Justice for Malik Carter, end the corruption, and Malik felt a surge of hope, fragile but real, the first crack in the machine grinding him down. Back in his cell the next day, transferred from the infirmary with a clean bill but a body still aching, Malik sat on his bunk, the concrete walls cold against his back, the graffiti above him a gallery of ghosts he might yet escape. The protests grew louder, their rhythm pulsing through the bars, and inmates whispered about the news, some eyeing Malik with grudging respect, others with sharper menace, the tension in the block crackling like a live wire. He thought of Terence, orchestrating this from Washington, his father's steady voice promising a fight, and Shonda holding on despite her vandalized car and lost job, her strength a beacon he clung to. But hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this, and Nathan Wells wasn't about to let it stand unchallenged. That afternoon, a guard escorted Malik to a cramped meeting room, the air stale with mildew, the walls a faded grey scarred with scratches. Wells waited inside, his dark suit pristine against the grime, his wiry frame coiled with a predator's calm, his slicked-back hair gleaming under the dim light. He sat at a metal table, his hands folded, his grin sharper than ever, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic, a crack in his usual swagger. The guard stepped back, leaving them alone, and Wells leaned forward, his voice low and urgent, a salesman pitching a desperate deal. "Your father's making waves, kid," he said, his tone smooth but edged with strain. Too many waves, and it's going to sink us all, so here's your out. Reduced sentence, 2 years. If you testify against him, say he cooked up evidence, framed me and Hargrove." Malik's stomach twisted, rage surging hot in his chest as he stared at Wells, the man who'd framed him, smeared him, tried to kill him, now asking him to betray the one person fighting to save him. He thought of Terence's vow, the affidavit tearing at Hargrove's mask, the protests shaking Atlanta, and Wells' words burned like acid, a plea wrapped in a threat. Malik leaned forward, his hands gripping the table, his voice steady despite the tremor in his bones. "You think I'd sell out my dad for you?" he said, his eyes locked on Wells's. "You're the one drowning, not me." Wells's grin faltered, his jaw tightening, and for a moment Malik saw fear in his eyes, a predator cornered by its own game. Then Wells stood, smoothing his jacket with a forced calm, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You're a fool, Carter," he said, "and fools don't last long in here. Think about it. 2 years or a lifetime. Your call." He turned to leave, but Malik wasn't done, his rage boiling over as he spat at Wells's feet, the wet splatter hitting the floor between them, a defiance that made Wells flinch before he stormed out, the door slamming shut with a clang that echoed in Malik's ears. The guard dragged him back to his cell, his ribs screaming with every step, but Malik's mind churned with Wells' offer, the audacity of it fueling a fire he hadn't felt since this began. He sank onto his bunk, the protest's faint roar a heartbeat in the distance, and clung to the hope Terence's counterstrike had ignited, a chance to turn this war around. But the knife twisted deeper that night, a betrayal sharper than any, before cutting through the fragile light. Hours after lights out, the cell door screeched open, and Miss Ellis, his former public defender, stepped inside. Her thin frame hunched, her cheap blouse wrinkled, her eyes shadowed with a guilt Malik hadn't seen in court. He sat up, his heart pounding, confusion warring with dread as she avoided his gaze, her hands twisting a crumpled tissue in her lap. "I need to tell you something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I took money, Malik, from Wells to tank your case. From the start, I didn't think it'd go this far, I swear." Malik's breath stopped, the air sucked from his lungs as her words sank in, a confession that tore through him like a blade. Ms. Ellis, the woman who'd promised to fight, who'd stood beside him in that rigged courtroom, had been bought. Before he even walked in, her shaky hands and weak objections a performance paid for with his future. "Why?" he choked out, his voice raw. "Why'd you do it?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks, her voice breaking. "I was drowning in debt. He offered me a way out. I didn't know they'd try to kill you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Before Malik could respond, she bolted, fleeing the cell as the guard stepped in, his smirk a silent taunt as he locked the door behind her. Malik sank back onto the bunk, his hands trembling with rage and despair, the weight of her betrayal crushing the hope Terence's affidavit had built. He'd trusted her, relied on her, and she'd sold him out, a pawn in Wells' game from day one. The protests outside faded to a dull hum, their promise hollow now, and Malik stared at the graffiti above him, the names and dates a blur through the sting of tears he refused to shed. Hours later, the guard returned, barking his name with a sneer. "Carter, sentencing's tomorrow, Hargrove's rushing it, life without parole on the table." Malik's blood ran cold, the words a death knell that echoed Wells' threat, proof they weren't done, weren't slowing down despite Terence's strike. Hargrove doubled down, her smirk a promise of vengeance, and Malik felt the walls close in tighter, the air stale with defeat. He thought of Shonda's vandalized car, the poison, the note threatening her life, and now this, a betrayal from within and a judge racing to bury him alive. Terence's fight loomed large, the affidavit a spark in the dark, but time was slipping away, the sentencing a guillotine poised to fall. Malik clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, the cut on his arm pulsing with fresh pain as he lay back, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. They wanted him broken, wanted him silenced, but he'd survived too much to fold now, his resolve a steel thread, stretched thin but unbroken, a vow to hold on until the end, whatever that might be. Malik Carter stood in the Atlanta courtroom, his wrists raw from cuffs that bit deeper than ever, The borrowed suit Shonda had sent now frayed at the cuffs and damp with sweat from the stifling heat seeping through the old building's walls. Sentencing day had dawned, a mere 24 hours after Hargrove's rushed announcement, and the room crackled with a tension so thick it pressed against Malik's bruised ribs like a physical weight. The gallery overflowed with onlookers, their whispers a low hum that buzzed like flies over a wound, the wooden benches groaning under their restless shifting. The air carried the faint scent of polished oak and desperation, every sound amplified. In the cavernous space as Malik awaited his fate, his body bore the scars of Fulton County Jail, the shiv's graze a dull throb beneath a bandage, the poison's after-effects a lingering tremor in his hands, the beatings a map of pain etched into his ribs. Judge Evelyn Hargrove presided from her towering bench, her gaunt face a mask of triumph, her icy blue eyes glinting with a cold certainty that had haunted Malik since his first appearance. Her grey hair was pulled back tight, her thin lips curled, into a smirk that promised no mercy, a predator savoring her kill. Nathan Wells sat at the prosecution table, his wiry frame coiled with a smug confidence, his dark suit pristine against the courtroom's faded backdrop, his predator's grin sharper than ever as he adjusted a stack of papers that held Malik's fabricated doom. Terence Carter stood beside Malik, his broad shoulders squared in a crisp navy suit, his face a stoic wall of control, but Malik saw the fury burning in his father's dark eyes, a quiet storm ready to break. Shonda sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles paled against her dark skin, her faded jacket a stark contrast to the polished suits around her eyes red but fierce, with a mother's unyielding hope. The protests outside had swelled overnight, their chants filtering through the courthouse walls. Justice for Malik, end the corruption, a roar that shook the air and rattled the windows, a testament to Terence's affidavit exposing Hargrove's white supremacist donor. Malik clung to that sound, a fragile lifeline in the chaos, proof the world hadn't fully turned against him despite Wells's smear campaign. Hargrove banged her gavel, the crack silencing the room, and leaned forward, her smirk widening as she prepared to deliver the sentence that would bury Malik alive. "This court has reviewed the jury's verdict," she began, her voice sharp and rehearsed, finding the defendant guilty of armed robbery based on compelling evidence and testimony, and given the severity of the crime, I hereby sentence Malik Carter to life without parole. Malik's breath stopped, his knees buckling as the words hit like a sledgehammer, the courtroom tilting around him, Shonda's choked sob a dagger in his chest. Life without parole, a death sentence in a cage, no chance to hug his mother again, no law school, no future, just the jail's concrete walls and the hate that had tried to kill him already. Terence gripped his shoulder, his hand steady but trembling with suppressed rage, his voice a low whisper in Malik's ear. "It's not over, son, hold on." But Hargrove's gavel hovered, poised to slam down and seal his fate, her triumph a palpable force that crushed the air from his lungs. Then the doors burst open, a thunderous crash that shattered the courtroom's stillness, and federal agents stormed in, their black vests emblazoned with bold white letters, FBI, their boots pounding, the marble floor as they fanned out like a tidal wave. Gasps rippled through the gallery, reporters scrambling for pens, onlookers leaping to their feet as the agents moved with precision, two flanking Hargrove's bench, their hands on their holsters, their faces grim with authority. "Stop this proceeding," the lead agent barked, a tall man with a shaved head and a voice that cut through the chaos. "Evelyn Hargrove, you're under arrest for bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder." Hargrove's smirk vanished, her face paling to a sickly white, her hands curling into fists on the bench as she shot to her feet, her voice shrill with disbelief. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is my courtroom." The agent didn't flinch, stepping closer as he produced a warrant, the paper crisp in his hand, his tone unyielding. "We've got recordings, Judge. You taking payoffs from your brother's shell company, plotting with Wells to frame this kid and silence him permanently. It's over." Malik's heart slammed against his ribs, a surge of shock flooding through him as the agent's words sank in, recordings proof a lifeline he hadn't dared imagine. Hargrove's eyes darted to Wells, a flicker of panic crossing her gaunt features. But the prosecutor was already sweating, his grin gone, his hands fumbling with his papers as another agent moved toward him. "Nathan Wells, you're under arrest." "To," the second agent said, his voice cold. "Same charges plus evidence tampering and witness coercion. We've got your confession on tape." Wells bolted upright, his chair scraping the floor, his voice rising in a desperate shout. "This is baseless. I demand to see the evidence. You can't do this." But the agent grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with a swift motion. Cuffs clicking shut as Wells struggled, his polished facade crumbling into a mess of sweat and fear. The courtroom exploded, reporters shouting, cameras flashing. The gallery buzzing with disbelief as Hargrove was pulled from her bench, her wrists cuffed, her icy glare replaced by a snarl of rage. Malik stood frozen, his legs weak but steady, the cuffs on his own wrists suddenly heavy with a different weight, a symbol of the system's failure now turned on its masters. Terence stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos, steady and fierce as he addressed the agents. "I orchestrated this," he said. "I baited Hargrove into a recorded payoff attempt after the affidavit, fed it straight to the feds. You've got everything you need to clear my son." The lead agent nodded, his expression softening for a moment as he turned to Malik, reaching for his cuffs with a key. "Case dismissed, kid," he said. "You're free. We've got Wells confessing on tape, admitting he framed you to curry favor with Hargrove's donors. It's airtight." The cuffs fell away, the metal clattering to the floor, and Malik's breath hitched, a sob breaking free as the reality crashed over him. Free after weeks of hell. Free. Shonda rushed forward, shoving past the bailiff, her arms wrapping around him so tight his ribs screamed, but he didn't care, burying his face in her shoulder as her tears soaked his suit, her voice a trembling whisper. "You're okay, baby, you're okay." Terence joined them, his broad hand resting on Malik's back, his face stone-faced, but his eyes glistening with a pride Malik hadn't seen since this began, the family whole again in a courtroom that had tried to tear them apart. The agents dragged Wells and Hargrove out, the prosecutor's shouts fading into the hall, Hargrove's composure cracking as she spat curses at the feds, her empire collapsing under the weight of her own corruption. Blake stood there, legs shaking, the sun streaming through the windows, warmer, brighter, real. As he inhaled deeply, the air tasting of freedom he'd thought lost forever. Shonda gripped his hand, her fingers trembling, and Terence stood beside them, his presence a rock against the storm they'd weathered. The press swarmed outside, reporters shouting questions as the family stepped onto the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, a chaotic welcome to a world that had turned on him and now demanded his story. "Malik, how do you feel to be free?" one yelled. "Mr. Carter, what's next for Wells and Hargrove?" another called. "Will you sue?" Terence raised a hand, silencing the noise with a gesture, his voice steady as he faced the crowd. "There'll be a full federal investigation into this court's corruption," he said. "Those responsible will face justice. That's all for now." The reporters kept shouting, but Malik barely heard them, his mind still processing the cuffs falling. Away the agents storming in, the tape that had flipped this nightmare on its head. Shonda brushed his cheek, her hand steadying as she checked him over, as if afraid he'd vanish, and Malik nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, grounding himself in her touch. The weeks after his release blurred into a whirlwind, his case dominating headlines, sparking outrage and calls for reform, more stories surfacing of innocent lives chewed up by the same machine that had nearly swallowed him. Malik stayed quiet, avoiding the cameras, the weight of his survival settling into his bones, a scar he'd carry forever. One evening, he sat across from Terence in his father's study, papers spread across the desk, documents of corruption and wrongful convictions, a map of the fight still ahead. Terence studied him, his gaze careful, and broke the silence with an offer Malik hadn't expected. "Join me at the DOJ, son," he said. "Use this. Make it mean something. We can change this system from the inside." Malik stared at the papers, the names of others who hadn't had a father like Terence to pull them out, and felt the weight of his weeks in that cell, the beatings, the poison, the lies, a fire that hadn't died but shifted. He shook his head, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "No, Dad," he said. I'm not going inside. I'm staying out here on the streets where it starts, where people like me don't have a voice until it's too late." Terence frowned, leaning forward, his tone gentle but firm. "It's a fight every step, Malik. Harder out there. You sure you're ready?" Malik met his gaze, his jaw set, a scar on his cheek from jail glinting in the lamplight. "I spent weeks in a cage for something I didn't do," he said. "There's thousands more who don't get out. I can't walk away from that. I won't." Terence watched him for a long moment, then nodded, a faint smile breaking through his stern facade. "All right," he said, "let's get to work." Years later, Malik Carter walked into courtrooms not as a defendant but as a defender. His name whispered in Atlanta's streets, a figure who'd turned his pain into purpose. He stood at rallies, his voice shaking the city that had tried to break him. A megaphone for the silenced, his scar a badge of survival etched into his skin. He'd once been a scared kid in a jail cell, waiting for justice to find him. Now he hunted it, chasing down every crooked cop, every rigged judge, every lie that stole lives like his had nearly been stolen. The protests that freed him grew into a movement, his face on signs, his story a spark that lit fires across the state, a testament to resilience in a system built to crush. Hargrove and Wells faced trials of their own, their careers ashes, their power stripped by the tapes Terence had wielded like a blade. But Malik knew it wasn't enough, not yet. The machine still churned, still devoured, and he'd fight it. Street by street, case by case, until it changed or broke. He stood on a stage one humid night, the crowd stretching before him, their chants a thunder that echoed his own heartbeat. Justice now, and Malik gripped the microphone, his voice steady, raw with the weight of his journey. "They tried to bury me," he said, his words cutting through the air. "But I'm still here, and so are you. We don't stop, we don't break, we rise." The crowd roared, a wave of defiance that shook the ground, and Malik stepped back, his scar catching the spotlight, his eyes burning with a purpose forged in hell. He wasn't the kid from the library anymore, not the honor student dreaming of law school. He was something more, something they'd never seen coming, a force born from their hate, a voice they couldn't silence. Shonda watched from the wings, her hands clasped, her tears proud now, and Terence stood beside her, his nod a silent vow to back this fight, wherever it led. Malik turned from the stage, the city sprawling before him, a battlefield he'd claimed as his own, and walked into the night, his steps firm, his resolve a steel core that wouldn't bend, wouldn't break, a promise to those still trapped that he'd keep fighting until the system burned or bowed. Malik Carter's journey reveals the brutal reality of systemic racism, where innocence can be a death sentence if you're black and powerless against a corrupt system. His story teaches us resilience, the kind forged in the fire of injustice, where every blow, beatings, betrayal, poison only sharpened his will to fight. It shows how power, wielded by figures like Judge Hargrove and Nathan Wells, can twist justice into a weapon, targeting the vulnerable to protect privilege. Yet Malik's survival hinges on family, with Shonda's unwavering love and Terence's strategic brilliance proving that support can turn the tide against overwhelming odds. The tale underscores the cost of silence, as Ms. Ellis's betrayal and the librarian's coercion highlight how fear and greed prop up corruption, leaving the innocent to suffer. Most crucially, it's a call to action, showing that freedom isn't handed out. It's seized through relentless resistance, whether in courtrooms or streets. Malik's choice to reject a cushy DOJ gig for grassroots activism drives home the lesson. Real change starts where the pain is rawest, not in polished offices. His transformation from victim to victor reminds us that justice isn't a gift from the system. It's a demand we must make ourselves. What do you think? Can one voice topple a corrupt system, or does it take a chorus? Comment below, hit like and subscribe if this fight resonates with you, and share to amplify Malik's stand. Thanks for joining this journey. May you find strength to challenge injustice wherever it hides.